Okay guys, welcome back to part 2 of our 3-part series about how to make knives from this, a crappy old file. Now, the cool thing about steel, the amazing thing about steel, and what's made it so important throughout history is that steel can do a variety of things. We can shape the working characteristics of the steel to make it harder, softer, more resilient, more brittle, have good edge holding, springiness, all kinds of things. And we do all this by varying the heating and cooling of that steel. Let's find out how this works with your knife. I've got a separate video in the works about the metallurgy of heat treating, which I encourage you to watch. But suffice it to say that heat treating is about using thermal cycling to get the appropriate working qualities from a given steel. Wait, sorry, that sounds really pretentious. What we're talking about with this particular blade is just a kind of flying by the seat of the pants way of getting a blade hard, but not too hard. We could go into insane amounts of detail about lamellar martensite and austenitization and cooling curves, but we're not. That's for another day. This is just going to be good old monkey see, monkey do. Here's how this works. We're going to start by busting out that crappy little charcoal fire we use to anneal the blade with. The first stage of heat treating is called hardening, sometimes also known as quenching. The intent of quenching is to get the maximum amount of hardness out of steel. So what we're going to do is put our file in the fire. We don't want to blast the crap out of it. What we want is to get the blade to a nice, even cherry red. If you get orange or yellow, you're overshooting a little. Just a nice cherry red. Try not to overheat the tip. And you don't want the tang heated at all. We want it to stay soft. Okay. So once we get to that magic color, we take the blade out and plunge it into a paint can full of oil. What kind of oil? Well, they're fancy engineered quenching oils that cost more than fine French wine, but we're using used motor oil. A better choice would be peanut oil or olive oil, which will give you that nice French fry smell instead of giving you lung cancer. But mineral oil or hydraulic fluid will work too. I don't want to give you the impression this is the optimal way of making a knife. It ain't, guys, but with the right kind of steel, it does work. As soon as the blade cools down enough that you can touch it, run the corner of a file down the blade. If it bites into the steel, your blade didn't harden, probably because you didn't heat it enough. If the file sort of skates over the steel, then it's nice and hard. Now, here's the problem. If you did everything right, it's actually too hard. So we'll now do part 2 of the heat treating process, which is called tempering. Old timers called it drawing. What we'll do now is degrease the knife and pop it straight into our kitchen oven, which we've preheated to 400 degrees. In addition to filling your kitchen with the smell of burning oil and making your life partner extremely happy with you, what you're doing is softening the steel just a hair, just enough so that it loses the brittleness that would cause it to snap if you bent it. Okay, so we'll temper it for an hour, take it out and let it cool for another hour or two, then retemper it for another hour. For you guys in metric land, that's about 200 degrees Celsius. So, once the blade's been tempered twice, we're ready to make a handle. In this case, we'll be using a chunk of fancy wood called California Buckeye Burl, but you can use any kind of wood you please. I'll begin by splitting the blank in half. Then, using a very flat surface and some sandpaper, I'll true it up and make it super flat. You'll see why shortly. There. See how they mate nicely together? Now I'm going to scribe a line around the tang of the blade and use a chisel to chisel out the tang so that the tang fits snugly in this little slot. you'll want to use some care so that it's a nice tight fit in all dimensions. Test fit it frequently so you don't overshoot. Now I'll mark a location for the hole where our cross pin will go that will hold the blade in the tang. If you've got a hand drill, great. If you've got a drill press, even better. But worst case scenario, you could actually use an old-fashioned brace and bit that you bought at the flea market for 50 cents. You want to make sure you get all your holes drilled before you glue the handle together. Once I've drilled the hole and I'm ready to glue the handle up, I'll go ahead and finish polishing my blade. I prefer to polish the blade at this point because once the blade is secured to the handle, you really can't do a decent job of polishing it. But if you polish before the drilling and all the fussing with the handle, there's a good chance you'll scratch your nicely polished blade. So, I'm going to use a couple of high-tech polishing tools. This one's what we in the industry call a popsicle stick, and this other item is known as a piece of wood. In all seriousness, we're going to use this little block of wood as a sanding block to hold the sandpaper and keep it nice and flat. So, basically what I'm going to do is start with fairly heavy grit wet or dry sandpaper. You want to use wet or dry sandpaper when polishing metal rather than standard woodworking sandpaper because you can lubricate the sandpaper without it falling apart, and that lubrication makes the sandpaper last longer. Notice that throughout the polishing, I'll be lubricating with WD-40. You can use 3-in-1 oil, whatever. The point is that it keeps tiny chips of steel from loading up in the sandpaper and diminishing the effectiveness of the sandpaper. Even so, the sandpaper wears out quickly, so I cut it into little strips, wrapping them around the sanding block, and then I move the sandpaper to a fresh section as soon as I start to feel it losing effectiveness. No point wasting a bunch of elbow grease on a piece of worn out sandpaper. So here's the basic principle of sanding, and this is really important. You want to start with a relatively heavy grit. In this case I'm starting with 220, but I could even start with 120 if I felt like it. And then you work your way up to finer and finer grits. The higher the number, the tinier the abrasive grains that coat the sandpaper, and the finer your finish. With each grit, you want to absolutely erase every single solitary scratch made in the previous stage. The hardest lesson, I'm going to say this again, the hardest lesson in basic knife making is just how ruthless you have to be in executing this basic principle. You'll be tempted to leave a couple of the most tenacious file scratches when you're working the 320 or the 220, and then you'll move up to the higher grits and that scratch will just sit there staring at you and making you feel like a jerk for wasting all this time. So don't do it, man. Don't do it. Don't leave that last scratch and think you'll clean it up with the next higher grit. Get them all. So I'll use my block and my popsicle stick. The stick will help me get into this little space here at the top of the blade. This area is called the ricasso. It comes from an Italian word which translates roughly as the place where knife makers start considering suicide. There's just no substitute for elbow grease here. Now look, ain't that pretty? So eventually I get everything nice and pretty with the lower grit sandpaper, and I'll start moving up through 320 and eventually get to 600 grit. Now an important principle of sanding, and this is what's going to help you reveal all those earlier scratches and make sure that you get rid of them effectively is that you want to change direction each time you change to a higher grit sandpaper. Keep changing that angle and it will reveal all the scratches in high relief from whatever you used before. Whereas if you go in the same direction, it's much harder to see your progress, and heavier scratches can kind of hide in the weeds and reveal themselves much later. So, next I'll clean up the spine of the knife using a piece of sandpaper on my workbench. You can do this as you move up with the flats, or you can do it all separately. That's up to you. Now you can work up to whatever grit you want to. If you want a kind of glossy surface, go to a high grit sandpaper like 1200, 2000, even 2500. If you want it more of a satin finish, quit at 600. So that's what I'll do here. In any case, wherever you stop, you'll want to sand straight down the blade as your final step. Here's how I do it. Now I'll mask the blade to keep from messing up my polish during the next step. Alright, that's it for part 2. So we've heat treated our steel and we've polished it, but that still doesn't make it a knife. We got to make a handle. That's coming up in part 3. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel, like me on Facebook at Walter Sorrells Blades, and check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you'll find examples of my knives and lots of instructional videos that you can't find here on YouTube.